All right. Well, I see our faces in the wonderful OBS, so that's always a good sign. Good afternoon, my friend Adib. Welcome to It's Monday. Happy Monday to you. Welcome to
Happy
Between
Monday
Chair
to
and
you too.
Keyboard. Thank you. Yeah, so for those of you who, or those folks who are watching who have no idea who you are, and I obviously know you very well. I've had many a good meals with you in various places. Why don't you tell our good viewers who you are and how you ended up here hanging out with me on a random Monday?
Hi guys, I'm Adib Saikali. I'm a principal solutions engineer with VMware. And how I ended up here is kind of a bit of an accident. Through I've almost been 7 years now with Pivotal slash VMware, and that was my first job in 10 years. Prior to that, I spent 10 years as an independent, going around, doing a lot of training and consulting, did a startup, built the product, didn't quite get the product market fit. So continued to need to have a job and decided to learn all about the sales world. So I joined Pivotal at the time as a sales engineer, and it's been super fun. So I'm still around. And my customers like to call me the code janitor because there's frequently giving me USB sticks with, millions of lines of code, and they say, "Well, here's our mission critical app that has makes us $1 billion a year, and we have lots of people working on it, and we have no consensus internally on what to do with this thing, but we want it to be more cloud native. Can you give us an opinion?" So I do a lot of that. So.
It's funny to me because I think about my educational background in computer science and all the different workshops and trainings and whatnot I've gone through. And we focus so much on greenfield, writing new code. And yet that is such a vanishingly small part of our actual job. So much of it is, as you say, it's the code janitor. I refer to it as software archaeology. Here's a bunch of code. Nobody really knows how it works, but we have to go make this change. Here, have fun. Why do you think we ignore that very key aspect of this industry? And there's very few instances. I mean, I guess there's Michael's book, How to Work Effectively with Legacy Code, which, I mean, maybe part of it is none of us actually wants to be responsible for that, because then we know we're going to get the worst code anyone's ever written thrown at us and said, here, you solve it. But it does feel like we try to ignore that. I mean, why do you think we skip over that aspect of software?
Um, I don't think there's one reason. Like some of my observations at that is that um, historically, software developers don't know how to speak economics. They don't know how to quantify the impact of something. So they present the choice to management as hit the deadline, or we can fix something. It's technical debt. It's like, we can delay it. Because from the point of view of the project manager, they're going to get a promotion if the project releases on time. And if there's stuff that is like toxic or bad in the code and it causes problems later, they'll be gone. So it's really like the developers will go and say, well, we really need to refactor the code, and then the project manager will be like, isn't there some way of hacking it? And the person will say, yeah, there is. Or somebody else on the team will say that it is. So everything just gets, the can just keeps getting kicked down the road. And there isn't really an appreciation at the, like, I would call it the business level for how these software issues affect them. I've recently had a customer make a strange decision to rewrite a 3 million line application, and they're going to release it in a couple of years. And so they have a big team of people that's rewriting it. And, that's very risky because the same cultural issues that gave you the code that you have, they
Still
don't
there.
disappear when you start a rewrite.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's the culture part of it.
Yeah, and that's something you and I've talked quite a bit about, and I'm a big proponent of the fact that we have to consider culture as part of these technology shifts as well. That it isn't just some magic of, oh, look, I got this in a container, ergo I'm cloud native. It's understanding all of the other things within your organization, the incentive structures, the that's how we've always done it kind of approach that seems to permeate. And I think the problem there is those are much harder issues to work through. It isn't just a go buy this piece of technology, or go install this and then everything is just magically solved. Everybody wants the silver bullet, the magic pill. Just give me a pill and I'll lose weight. I don't want to exercise or eat right. And I think
Yeah.
that just seems endemic almost in our species.
Well, it's really like the incentives that people have, right? Like if you're in technology, you're kind of measured. If you're a developer, you're measured on productivity, like how many features did you code for me? If you're in operations, you're measured on uptime and stability. So if you're in operations, you don't want to change anything. You don't want to use the latest technology because that's dangerous and that could reduce or that could cause downtime, which can cause you to lose your bonus. On the other hand, if you're a developer, you're like, if I don't use the latest stuff, I can't use as much features. So you get these like conflicts that are on the surface look like they're, you know, rational, but at the bottom line, it's just about people's incentives and bonuses. And if you expand that beyond just tech, then you get to see the different incentives the project managers have. Not the, when I say project manager, I mean the people in charge of the priority list, deadlines, and all this type of stuff, and then the incentives that the finance slash business people have, and it's that those tensions between these different incentives that are kind of cause the situation that we're in all the time.
How much do you think is just sort of a technical literacy aspect of this? It wasn't that long ago where the CIOs are pretty adamant that we're just a cost center. We're just here to support the business. This is not a
Yeah,
technology company. And I think one of the things you and I have certainly talked about is the fact that today most organizations will say the exact opposite. They'll say, well, we're a technology company first and foremost. We just happen to be in retail or banking or whatever. And I'm curious what your sort of vision or insight is around, is that as widespread as I want to believe it is? Is this somewhat a situation where you've got people making these decisions who don't have that level of technical knowledge, and we don't do a good enough job of explaining these things to them? I mean, how do you think that factors into this equation?
I actually think there's two parts to it, and the first part is that um, it's like if you compare it to buildings, like buildings have building codes and electrical codes, and you can't, like, as the CEO or the business person, say, well, I really don't want to put a whatever it is safety feature X when I put up this building because it's more expensive. You don't get a choice because the building code says you have to, and the whatever engineers put together the building code, you know, it's there for a reason. Unfortunately, usually people died before whatever thing got
Right.
added to the building code to make the building more fire resistant, or earthquake proof, or things like that. So we don't have the equivalent of that. That is a hard external kind of code that no business person can push against because the code says you got to do X, right? The other side of it is that in some interactions with some like CTO, bank level CTOs, SVPs, EVP level people in like big massive banks, I played this game of like, well, what happens if I'm them, right? Like I'm the EVP responsible for all the bank's technology. What do I know about technology? Do I know how the ATM machines in the bank work? Maybe, maybe not. Do I know how the data center completely works? No. Maybe I was a developer 30 years ago. So I have to rely on the people working for me.
Right.
And it tends to be that the people working for me, they're motivated by whatever objectives, MBOs that have been given to them. And so if there's a new technology or something to be done, there's always going to be going to put it to my team and say, hey, what should we do about X? And if there's kind of agreement, then great, it's obvious to do that. But if there's really strong disagreement between, say, one VP wants something, the other VP wants something completely different, it's really hard for me as that EVP to make a choice, because like I go like, yeah, maybe I used to know stuff, but I don't know the latest things. So you're always having to rely on people. So what I find is that all of these executives have a very, very small group of people that they trust.
Right.
And it's whatever those people say that they'll be like, I just count on Nate because I know Nate gets a job done. So it doesn't really matter to me what's technical or not. I've put my faith in Nate, and if he says it's good, it's good. So I see this a lot because like people it, people make these mistakes when they're in their thinking because they think they know better, and it's really hard, like being in those positions, like what's best for this massive bank. I don't know. It's people are think they're doing the right thing. It may not be, but
Right.
they don't have a way of seeing how they're thinking.
Yeah, that's a great point. I remember pretty early on in my sort of now you're an architect career, my manager took me aside and made that point to me. He said, Nate, listen, you got to understand that we all have trusted advisors. And if you really want to get something done, you've got to go whisper in the ear of the trusted advisor of the CIO, the EVP, the VP, whomever, and because that's who they listen to. And he said, for example, I listen to you about things around JavaScript and Java and the areas that I know you're an expert on. If I have questions about that, I'm coming to you. And so part of growing that influence is being able to look inside your organization and go, ah, okay, this is the person. If I can convince them, then they will be able to convince that decision maker.
Yeah, I mean, there's also too the fact that it's really hard to quantify financially the impact of technical decisions. So if you look at like really mature industries like retail, right? Like I when I went to school and I like was reading some accounting books, started like reading about this thing called just-in-time inventory. I remember certain like retail shops like Kmart and things, companies that are no longer there. And at one point, I remember reading something about like Walmart, how Walmart like took over the world with this thing called just-in-time inventory. And just-in-time inventory was, revolutionary because it allowed them to be more profitable and outcompete their um, their competition, be better than them. So it seems like in things like retail, there's like well-established frameworks for, is this a good decision? Is this a bad decision? There isn't something like that for the software world. It's always
Sure.
like, how do I evaluate if this is a good decision or not? The technical decisions, I don't know. We don't have the metrics. We don't have the history. There aren't established frameworks, right? Like take something as simple as, should we get our developers two screens? It's like it's like, yeah, it makes you more productive, but from the
Right.
point of view of like some people, they'll be like, well, why are we spending all this money on this? Now we need to have bigger desks, whatever it is, right? Like it's not the frameworks aren't developed. It's just, I think, a function of how young our field is. It's only like what, 50 years, 100,
Right.
it's not even 100 years yet. So
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point, and that's something I always like to remind people of. Is this is a very immature industry, especially compared to engineering disciplines and so many other things that have been around for. I mean, we've been building homes and bridges and roads for millennia, and we've kind of gotten good at it. And to your point, when mistakes happen, we study it, we look at it. I mean, my home state here, I can't remember how many years this was ago, but a bridge fell down during rush hour, and I guarantee you that engineering students all
yeah,
around the world reviewed that bridge, when it happened, when the report came out that detailed why the bridge fell down. Again, engineering students around the world looked at that. Whereas in our industry, projects fail all the time, and we just go like, "What? Nothing to see here. Sweep it under the rug. Let's pretend everything was successful." And I've certainly seen some pretty bad behavior there where I remember one time an app got put into production just so that we could check the box so that somebody could get their accountabilities, even though the app didn't work and didn't do what it was supposed to do, but somebody needed their bonus. So it went to production and then was shut down. So we see this kind of
that's
behavior that doesn't allow us to improve. And I think, again, to your point, it's because this is pretty immature.
well, there's no building code, there's no civil
Right.
liability. Nobody gets sued for a bad software project. Like I remember, like, at least where I live in Canada, right? Like there's been, the fair share of government IT projects that were started out were going to cost $100 million, and then $1 billion later, it gets canceled and it didn't never worked and all this type of stuff. but it's like the most famous one in Canada was that Phoenix, the Canadian government decided to redo their payroll system, and not only did it not work, people were either not getting paid or getting paid too much, and some people like government employees, like they had their houses, like they're defaulted on their mortgages because they're just not getting paid, and it was all the standard kind of typical like what's wrong with IT projects type of thing. But even in that situation, like nobody was held accountable. Like
Sure.
if you hire an electrician to rewire your house and they mess it up, like there's some liability onto them, right? Like, yeah, sure, they might have insurance and all of it, but there's like, did you follow the electrical code, right? Like, where is the equivalent of that in our industry?
Right.
Maybe we're, 25, 30 years away from it. Unfortunately, it means that we have to acknowledge that there is expertise that's actually worth listening to. And that's not part of how our industry is. Our industry values like, oh, I never went to school. I just read a manual on the weekend and I became a programmer. And yeah, now I'm the world's best programmer in whatever hot technology X is. You all people that came before me don't know what you're doing, right? Like it's not a
Right.
we don't value the historical knowledge. We think it's outdated.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you and I were talking about that a little bit on the pre-show, and it is one of those things that I think we fail at in terms of how we educate people in this industry. The analogy I would make is if you were going to get a degree in, I don't know, English literature, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're going to read a lot of English literature. You're not just going to write a bunch of literature. And
Yeah,
yet, how do we teach people computer science? Go write a bunch of programs. We don't teach you how to read code. We don't teach you how to deal with this code that's been around for 10 or 15 or 20 years and has been patched upon patched upon patched. Now, but that's what you have to do in the real world. That's that software archaeology that we all have to perform,
yeah.
and yet we don't really teach that.
Well, that's because I think, like, I mean, at the university I went to, very much kind of frowned on programming. Like, computer science was more about like how fast your algorithm was, and the theoretical computer science. They did have like operating systems courses and
Sure.
courses where you wrote a lot of code, but like you could get a sense like the profs didn't really care about writing code. It wasn't There was like kind of they got to those positions by inventing cool algorithms,
Mm,
and the problems of industrializing the building of software was kind of like beneath them. Like, oh, that's just engineering.
right.
Where the like the physicists and the engineers, they're like, yeah, we're theoretical physicists. Don't bug us about like how to build,
Right.
the logistics of building a city. We don't care, right? We
That's
want to
beneath us.
figure out something else. Yeah, it's not what I'm here for. So there's like a little bit of that, and it's also too, like I think what could change that is I could see in the future with all this open source that maybe your final exam is fixing a bug in an open source
Mm,
project.
sure. Sure.
Or like go identify 5 places where something is could be improved. But it's like it's there's so much context that's just not possible to capture in software. Like, you have to become part of that community of people
Right.
to get their way of thinking, and it's implicit knowledge is only obvious if you're part of it. And if you're on the outside, you're like, I don't understand how people tolerate certain things in these tech communities, like, I don't know, dynamic typing.
Well, to your point earlier, one of the things that I've seen in my career, I remember having this conversation with a developer. It was fairly early on in his career. And he said, Nate, I'm trying to do it right. I get a bug and I go in and I write the tests and I try to leave the code better than when I found it. So it takes me a couple of days. And then there's this senior guy who, quite frankly, causes just as many problems as he solves. He's a cowboy. He comes in and he's setting fires while he's putting out other fires. But management loves him because he gets stuff done, quote unquote, and he gets it done fast. And so he was literally had this one-on-one where his manager said, "Why aren't you more like that guy who gets it done really quickly?" He says, "I give him a bug and it's done in a couple hours. I give you a bug and it's done in a couple days. How And it's like we need to educate a whole, sort of layer of management too needs to understand the differences between the quick and dirty slap it together, I caused 3 bugs while fixing this one bug, versus I did it right, the code's better than when I found it, and by the way, we now have more tests than we had before. And I don't know how we educate that.
I don't think that's education, honestly. I think that's like going back to the building analogy.
Hmm.
That's like having inspectors. Like you
Right.
rewiring the house, you got to get the electrical inspector. You got to get you're like where I live, you're building a deck and it's more than, 60 centimeters off the ground. You got to get the building inspector to inspect it. And I kept thinking about this. I'm using this because I'm going through a house renovation right now. And I'm kind of waiting on an electrical inspector who can't come because there's COVID going on. And it's like, it's amazing to me, like, because it's called inspecting elsewhere, but we call it code reviews
Right.
in software, right? And the code reviewer in software usually is like well known, like there's kind of a relationship between them. If we're on the same team, you review my code, whereas the inspectors in the building industry are more kind of
Great
like,
point.
well, I'm coming in, I've got my list of things that I'm going to inspect you on. I don't care how you feel, Nate.
Right.
If you're doing it wrong, I'm going to tell you this. So as I've been working with the electrician rewiring my house, it's been kind of informative where he'll tell me like, yeah, the inspector won't agree to that. And sometimes I can push back and be like, well, what about this? Tell me more. Why? And I'm like, oh, he's just like doesn't want to do it because it's a bit more work or
Sure.
more effort. But there's definitely this kind of objective: is this good or not? Is this meeting the minimum requirements? Which in your example, if there was a way to inspect the quality of the work, then you would be able to say, okay, sure, you're really fast, but I would never hire you to renovate my house because you don't do a good job, right? I
Right.
want the guy who takes 2 days and does a job well, right? Uh, it's like that and everything. And I think this is people's personalities. Some people are okay with it and some are not,
Right.
like with the slapdash work.
Right. Well, and again, to your point, I believe that that was incentives, that this individual who was going quick and dirty and fast had been praised for that for most of his career. So why would he do it any
Yeah.
different? He keeps getting promoted. He must be doing something right. And I think as well, when you've got folks who, well, I'm not going to be around in 6 months or a year anyway, so I don't care if it's a bigger problem in the future. And I think that's why we have these building inspectors to come in and say, well, no, we won't even give you a certificate of occupancy because this is dangerous for someone to even live in. You can't get away with that slapdash kind of work. And I don't know. I want to believe we'll improve in this industry. And one of the things I'd be curious your thoughts on, I had somebody ask me a couple weeks ago, do I ever think we'll get to a point where AI will be smart enough to write programs for us, where we'll just say, hey, AI, build this? And will that happen before or after we get some more of this engineering discipline that I think we so sorely need?
I don't know that I don't know the answer to that. I think potentially some AI type tools might be good at doing inspections, coding
Sure.
inspections. Like that could be something where you kind of get that immediate feedback where some sort of automated code review tool tells you you didn't do that job well enough, right? Like
Right.
I recently was doing a side project and decided to turn on every possible tool that could nag you, like Sonar Cube,
Yep.
all the features like BMD. If there was like some way of adding a code analyzer to it, I added it. And I was actually blown away by how much of a crappy developer I am, because it was just constantly pointing out to me things I was doing wrong. I'm like, oh, I didn't see that. Oh, I didn't see that. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna really try really, really hard to have it so Sonar Cube is not complaining about anything.
Right.
And for the most part, like made the code a lot better. Um, it really did, because like I didn't know like there'd be things like, well, you're defining this variable and it's 4 lines below where you should be using it. And I'd look at the code and like, so how do I not violate that rule? Oh well, that'll cause me to think about the problem in a different way. And it's it's again like I think we have a lot of these tools that
Right.
will kind of help you make your code base better. But again, does management value that? And it's this like tension between shipping and valuing these things. There's this assumption that if you value it, you're not going to ship on time, or things will take longer and you'll be outcompeted. Um, and I don't think it's true, but I mean, you could take it to I could at least theoretically see how you could spend a lot of time refactoring things and never ship anything.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
that can't happen. I've seen that happen too. And this is where, where the power balance is. If the developers are in charge, it's always going to be like, is my technology the best possible? If the business people are in charge, they're like, we don't care. Can we make money with this? And if the project managers are like have the most power, then it's all going to be all about the deadlines, right? And the budget. So
Right, right.
it's also like amazing to me how like very large companies that are become very famous because they are like, I don't know, let's pick on one. Let's like say Google, right? Or Facebook or Netflix. And as developer, you hear about the way Google does things or the way Netflix does things. And it's a very there's always something that gets picked out as an attribute as the thing they do.
We cherry pick
And then
something.
everybody tries to do that thing. It's
Yep.
like, well, I want to do this because Google is doing it or Netflix is doing it. And there's probably like there's nuance that gets lost
Right.
that was there, and then it becomes a bit of just a cargo culting of of things. And then usually you find out like 10 years later or 15 years later that no, that very thing they were doing, while it was appropriate at the time, ends up leading into the thing that blows them up
Right.
because they become too blind to how they're working. And so it's like if there's one educational thing, it would be like how to think critically about what you're doing to see if what you're doing now is the right thing for the situation you're in, for the objectives that you have. And it's never obvious whether you're doing the right thing or not. So you have to have like more of a team conversation, but
Hmm.
then to have the team conversation, you need to have the maturity to question what you know.
Right.
For
Well,
a lot of people is going to be like
and and
hard.
and to be able to challenge the that's how we've always done it. And the fact that in most situations the people who are in power are the ones who have excelled in that system or know how to game that system, and so you show up and try to adjust that, and that's a direct threat to their power. They usually don't take that lightly, and they're going to do everything in their power to stamp that out.
Yeah.
And so I love that point about we look at a company that was successful or a project that was successful and we cherry pick. And I see this with technologies all the time, where a company will use insert whatever tech you want here and had a really successful project. And everyone says, oh, we need to use that too. And they stop to ask,
Yeah.
well, do we even have those same forces? Is that appropriate for our situation? It's like taking the training habit of some extremely good athlete and saying, I'm going to do this one thing, and realizing, no, that's just one part of their overall
Yeah.
the technique. I remember years and years ago, I was in Colorado Springs and I was eating at this restaurant, and Michael Phelps walked in, right? Because the training center is right there. And so the swim team showed up, and you could just feel it in this restaurant, like a switch flipped, the buzz, like, what's going on? Oh, Michael Phelps is here. And I don't remember how many calories this guy was consuming when he was at his peak, but it was tens of that, 10,000, 12,000
Yeah.
calories. Well, you could look at that and say, "Oh, I'd be a world-class swimmer if I ate 12,000 calories a day." No, that would be me taking the wrong piece of data out of that. And while I might
Yeah.
enjoy that, I would probably eat the calories in the wrong way. I'd be like, another piece of cake, please. So I see that a lot in our industry, where we pick on that one thing instead of realizing it's part of this holistic aspect, and may ultimately not even be that important, might even be counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish, but that's not readily visible until years later.
Yeah. I mean, like one of my favorite ones is mono repo versus multi repo, right? And it's like, the should we should we have like one big repo with all the company's code in it, or should we have lots of small ones? And there's like, that's a question that has no answer.
Right.
Like there isn't a correct answer for it. There is a, what stage is your project at? If you're, 5 people working together, you all know each other and you just do git checkout once, then that's good. And then there's the, you know, the you're now 500 people and it's too much, or you're 500 people and you're Google and you have a distributed build cache and you have all these things. It's really like, what's more interesting to ask is the question is, how do you know? How did Google know, or successful team X or Y know that they made the right decision? When you made the decision, did you also like put some criteria in place
Right.
to say, here's how we're going to test if the decision we made is the correct one? And then been humble enough to basically change direction once you were proven wrong. But that's like the mystery of all of this, is that there's a, you have to just be willing to be wrong. You just have to realize nobody knows everything. I don't know everything. And you can't wrap up your identity inside of like, I'm a really good developer, I'm a really good technologist, I'm a really good whatever, and just be like, okay, I'm human, I'm going to make mistakes. And, you know, what I aspire to be personally is the best student ever, self-learned taught student. Like learn as much as I can, learn from my mistake, learn from the mistakes of others. And, that's really all one can hope for.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It is around the need for humility and understanding that none of us knows all of it. None of us is perfect. We all write bad code. And in fact, I remember we had an expert panel once where we all introduced ourselves by saying, "Hi, my name is Nate, and I write bleepy code," just to reinforce everybody that we all have written bad code at some point in our lives. The important thing is learning from that, and hopefully, you write better code today than you wrote 2 years ago. But I've noticed some of my grad students have had this conversation with me around imposter syndrome, and what I've counseled them on is the reality that we all feel that from time to time, and it's concerning to me if you've never felt like you were a bit of an imposter in this industry, because there is just so much to know. There's so many
Yeah.
frameworks, there's so many languages, databases, etc. How could you possibly know all of it? And I think that's part of being, as you get more senior in your career, is hopefully you've developed a bit of that and you're willing to say, I don't know, could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and it's also too, um, the nasty side of it, of the imposter syndrome, and I've experienced it quite a bit in my life, is that sometimes you're afraid to ask a question publicly,
Right.
because you're like, well, how are people going to think? People think, team lead should know the answer to this or that. And I remember when, like, Stack Overflow came out, and it was like a revolutionary thing, and you could ask all these questions, right? You had like, you'd look at things, and you're like, wow, that was a good question. And asking a good question is actually quite hard. And
Yes.
it's like the imposter syndrome. Yeah, I unfortunately don't have advice other than, at least I can share my story with that, which was, at some point I just gave up and I said, I don't care. I really don't care if people think I'm a moron, because I'm spending too much time thinking about it. And
Right.
like, how it's, in my case, how it started for me, I went to, uh, like, the university I went to was, it's a very good university, University of Waterloo, for computer science. And you're like feeling like you're the stupidest, smartest person. And you're like, well, I only scored, X on the math competition, and this other guy scored like, twice as much as I did,
Right.
or,
Right.
and it's like, okay, take a step back. You actually had a chance to write this math competition and actually answered more than one question, which is, it's a very good start. But it's really like the problem with it, like, I think how I eventually got over the imposter syndrome is I stopped focusing on what I know and started focusing on what can I contribute in a specific situation. So I don't judge my value based on what I know. I judge my value in a situation on what I can contribute to that, which causes you to ask the question, in the service of what am I doing X? So I'm here to help with the situation, with the customer, with whatever it is, and you have to like say the priority isn't how I feel, the priority isn't what I know, the priority isn't to show off what I can do, the priority is to accomplish outcome X for something bigger than me. And so how I feel about the situation doesn't really matter, because I really frankly don't remember what I felt like a month ago, so it doesn't really matter. I'll forget it by tomorrow morning anyway. So
Well, I don't remember when I first heard this or where I first heard this, but it's important to remember that comparing yourself to others is always going to be a losing battle, because no matter what you're talking about,
yeah,
there's always somebody who's better than you. There's always somebody that's worse than you, and it's really a destructive thing ultimately to focus on. I've had this conversation with my son around golf. There are a lot of really good golfers in this world, and the higher you get towards that top, the better they are. And there's only one person who's ranked number one, even though all of the people who are on the PGA Tour who have ever teed it up on the PGA Tour are exceptional golfers. Only one is number one. And so you have to appreciate I'm the best me I can be, and you have to get comfortable with that. And we all have these sort of unique, interesting gifts, and so you just have to rely on that. But it's hard to do that because it's so easy to compare yourself to the person who had a better round or the person who did this or that, and it seems almost endemic to how we exist as a species.
yeah, and it's like I said, the only solution I have for this, just focus on what contribution can I make? Is this contribution going to make a difference to whoever or whatever I'm contributing it to? And if the answer is yes and yes, then that's good. That's really all. Like, I don't know, that's setting the bar to a level that makes it possible to be happy and have a good, productive life. I
Yep.
mean, this is one of the things, like, we just giving too much importance to technology. Sometimes we forget about, you know, the rest of life. It's not just about computers.
Right. So one of the
That's
things
that's the
that
easy part.
and I mean I've often thought about this when we talk about culture. I know how to solve technology problems. I feel like I'm pretty good at solving technology problems. The thing that I've realized as I've been in this industry longer, those are rarely the real problems. Projects rarely fail because we chose the wrong language or we chose the wrong database or we
Yeah.
used microservices or we didn't use microservices. It fails because of a cultural issue. It fails because of some personal dynamic, and those are much more challenging to solve. I mean, I think everybody's been on that project that everybody recognized this should be killed. This project is not serving the organization's needs, but it doesn't because of some political consideration or somebody's got some chits that they're playing or whatever. And now we all have to do this death march because politics, and then it silently gets shut down later. That's way above my pay grade to solve in most organizations.
Yeah, and like I just want to question something. Like, politics is, like, we always, everybody, like including myself, it's like, politics, right? Like, there's that kind of like, if only politics didn't exist. But I don't know if it's possible to ever get around politics. It's just part of the human condition. So I wonder if at some point there'll just be like the laws of politics, or the ethique of how to actually do politics. So
Well,
it's a
but
little bit more civilized, right?
we don't focus on that in our industry. We all try to pretend that it doesn't exist, that it's all a meritocracy, that the best idea always wins, but that's not the case. And I remember having that conversation with one of my managers, and he actually took this 2 or 3 day course on it, and he was really surprised because the very first thing the instructor said is, you can't get away from politics. You put 3 people in a room, you got politics. So this is not about eliminating it. It's about dealing with it, managing it, understanding it. And so I think we love to blame it for a lot of problems, but we also are reluctant to want to do anything about managing it or coexisting with it, if you will.
So I think I would say to the literacy question earlier, what I would love to have learned in school is how to do politics in the
Yes.
IT world.
Yes.
And it's like it's just not part of the curriculum.
No.
And like what I find is a lot of there's certainly like what is the difference between a team lead and a junior developer? Team lead knows how to do politics. You can't get to that, and it takes a while. And I've seen this quite a bit, um, where there's some really smart techies, they just can't win the argument, and it's because they get wrapped up into the false belief that the best it's a meritocracy.
Right.
And when they think it's a meritocracy, if they're not winning the argument, they think that their idea is wrong. When the issue isn't that their idea is wrong, is that they don't know how to play politics.
Right.
And this is the flip side of it is if they get agreement, then they think that the idea is correct technically, but it might not be. So, so this is the problem with with things. Yeah, like politics. That's the desire is to get good at it.
I think that plays into something you and I've talked about. You were kind enough to come speak with my grad students this semester, and you were, as I told you earlier, one of my most popular presenters this semester. And one of the things that you talked about that I've sort of latched onto as well is that skills have a different lifespan. Some skills are good for 5 years, some are good for 15 years, some are good for 50. And one of the things I've really tried to do with my grad students this entire year is try to help them hone those skills that will be valuable to them, not just over the next 3 to 5 years, but over their entirety of their career. Uh, can you sort of illuminate me a little more on that, or some of the conversations we've had? I think that's a really valuable thing for people to understand.
Yeah, I mean, like the stuff around like the way I think about it, like this is something I learned from Scott Ambler years ago. And he classified this type of career skills into like, what he called like kind of platform skills. Hey, you're the first guy. It's 2007. iPhone 1.0 is out. You get your IDE and you learn how to write iOS code. And you're highly in demand from 2007 till say 2013, 5 years. You can charge $200 an hour, and like because there's not a lot of people that know this now. Like for the last 5 years, it was like, oh, you're the Kubernetes person, you're the microservices person, you're the whatever it is. Like fill in the blanks, technology X, right? And that's good for 5 to 10 years. And then he talked about like paradigms and how like the paradigm that something is based on usually lasts about 25 years. And then you had like the communication skills, being able to give people good feedback. Wow, how useful is that? Being able to run a meeting, being able to present your ideas, to speak, public speaking, being able to write clearly and make your case in writing, being able to, these are all skills that are super valuable, but you like they don't have courses on
Right.
writing for techies, because whenever people say writing, they're like, well, oh, write an essay from reading Jan Shakespeare or something like in English class, right? Like it's not what you want. It doesn't motivate you to write really well. But if they in the writing, like in the school, they would give you a, okay, you have to decide what to do in this situation. Like say you're in CS school, you have an application, it's 2 million lines of code, this is what's been done, more of like a case study. And it's like what you're supposed to do is submit a decision. And it was kind of, I never really experienced that. In my university career, the closest I got to it is I was taking a 20th century history course. And the assignments were very interesting because what you had to do is take a historical decision that had to be made, like, and then you had to read the um, what was written. So like say it's the US, okay, should we drop the atomic bomb in Hiroshima?
Hmm.
And so your assignment was to read the memos that were given to the US president arguing for and against, and then your assignment was to write your own recommendation or something like that, right?
Wow.
So you have like you have the historical, kind of like, this is what was actually advised. So these kind of very ambiguous, what do you do in X, and then you get feedback on, like you get feedback on like, hey, can I actually put this in writing? So like I wish that schools and universities will do this more often for technical things. So you cannot finish and graduate university without being really good at technical presentation,
Yeah.
technical speaking, technical arguments, because that would mean you don't have the situation where the loudest person wins all the time because they happen to be the loudest person. And
Right.
like it's a problem because a lot of the techies think of themselves as introverts, and a lot of us are, right? Like, and we make the mistake of thinking being an introvert means you can't publicly present, which is
Right.
completely related. Like I'm
Well,
an introvert and I can present.
yeah. Well, and I think to your point, we have this tendency to look at it as, oh, a soft skill. I don't think that's useful. It's all about meritocracy. It's all about how good you can code. And there, we almost dismiss those soft skills as being unimportant. And I think we do that to our own detriment. Is I think there's a huge, it would help developers immensely in their career if they would take the time to learn how to write effectively, how to present effectively, but there's not a lot of appetite there in my experience with people who would actually sign up to take that. They view it as, again, just not as important as the latest and greatest piece of technology. And I wonder what it takes to sort of change that mindset. And maybe it's just as you grow in your career, you realize it's important. And as we have a comment saying about maybe politic has got a negative connotation we should talk about in terms of influence. And I think that's a great point, that what you need to be successful as you progress in your career is the ability to influence these decisions, and that's, again, something we don't teach.
No, we don't. No, it's very unfortunate. Well, interestingly, though, open source software is the one place where a lot of stuff happens, at least used to, on mailing lists.
Sure.
If you think of classic open source projects like, I don't know, Postgres, for example, like they don't even have a bug tracker. Everything happens on the mailing list. There's some open source projects where you have to argue it there and in writing. And that's an example of something where you can't participate in open source contributions if you're not able to draft a, I don't know, Kubernetes world, a Kubernetes enhancement proposal, like CAP, Java, a JAP, right? And that's like, it's a big barrier to do that. And I see that internally too, where um, you want something to happen in your company and there's some sort of process you're supposed to follow, and it feels like you're just doing, it's not pleasant to write it, but writing is one of those things that's just so important.
Right.
It is the most important skill set. That's what I hope I'll be able to convince my kids to get to practice. I don't know, how do you say, okay, I want a new video game, okay, you need to write me in a proper 3-pager formatted correctly with bullet points for why we need to buy Plants vs Zombies, or
Right.
whatever game they want, right? It's fascinating. It's fascinating. All this the human aspects of it are like, will mature. I think our industry will get better at it. I have no doubt about it, because it happened in other industries. That's
Right.
the other thing. I know, like how many electrical, do you have any friends that are like electrical engineers?
Hmm.
They never talk about electrical engineering things when I'm around them. But like techies are like, oh, you're a programmer. Oh, what? And people just want to talk about the stuff. Like there's so much change in that industry that it's not in our industry, that it just feels like you have to talk about it. But it's like,
Right.
why, right? Like,
Yeah, that's a great point. I think so many of these things that we read into it boils down to the fact that this industry has been around about a human generation, and it's part of why I think it's so hilarious when people, because this is again getting back to that imposter syndrome thing. You have people who are like, well, if you didn't get a computer science degree, you shouldn't be a programmer. I've seen that attitude a few times. It's like, you realize that it wasn't that long ago that you could not have had a computer science degree because it did not exist as its own standalone major. It was
Yeah.
maybe a minor in the math department, and you were taught by a bunch of people who had PhDs in math. And so I think we need to be, we're sort of at that point, I guess, in medicine, when if you knew which plant was going to kill you and which one wasn't, then you were a doctor. And
Yeah.
it'll change, and we've already started to see some of that specialization around different, whether it's cloud or front end or databases. I mean, it's amazing to me just how many kinds of database choices we have
I,
today versus 20 years ago.
I think we're in the stage of the your dentist is the barber
Yes.
stage.
Yes. Yep. You'd go to the same person to get a shave as you would to get a tooth pulled. Yeah, yeah, we're the same thing, and it's gradually. Well, maybe not gradually. I think it has accelerated just because it has to. But I love that was it Alan Kay quote about, if you're serious about software, you build your own hardware. I think we've kind of gotten past that mostly, where we're all pretty happy to just press a couple buttons and poof, compute appears in some data center somewhere. But this will take, there'll be some growing pains, there'll be some bumps along the road. And oh yeah, so our commenter against talking about it, it's hard to do this in college because it's this sort of collaborative cooperative environment, different assessment mechanisms, influence, and that's saying, yeah, it's a great point, that influence is different in a college setting than it would be in a work setting. And some work cultures are a bit more almost sadistic in terms of, well, I'm going to actually pit these three organizations against each other. We're going to have three versions of this going on, and may the strongest one win, and sort of encouraging some not such great behavior. But
But you can kind of like, this is kind of a, there are books that have been written that as a, like in college you could read. Like there's one called, I remember reading it a long time ago. It's called Showstopper, and it was about like the release of Windows NT 4.0, and it kind of chronicled how that went about, and it gets into a bit of the human aspects of it. So it's, I agree. Like, yeah, in college, like you're not trying to, it's not the real world, but that doesn't mean that you can't get an assignment where it's how well you communicate something counts just as much as whether you got the right algorithm or
right,
you did the right thing or you're being asked to make a recommendation, or you're kind of presented with these are some examples of public failures of IT projects. And take the Phoenix payroll in the government of Canada, where blah blah blah. So here's the project, here's the impact on the people, here's whatever the parliamentary investigation revealed afterwards, and your assignment is to read bits of that. Or there's enough historical things now that I think a course like that in the university would probably be a good idea. Maybe even bring some of the people that worked on those projects in to
right.
speak to the students, and be like, yep, I was the one that made that decision, and like it wasn't a good decision. Or um, there's that sense of like, I'm struggling to find the right words for it, but it's something along the lines of acknowledging that you don't know what you're doing, but that you still have the authority to make the decision, that you
Right,
have to make a decision.
right.
And like the best book I've had on this is a book called Dialogue Mapping, and it talks about something called wicked problems, which are problems that you don't know whether you've solved it well or not. You only get one chance at solving it, and it's amplified by social complexity because there's multiple like people that need to participate. So something like, where do we put the new subway line? Should we invest in building this product or that product? Should we add a feature or not? And those are always like, you get one shot at doing it, you get it wrong, you may end the product, it may not work, and it's just so many voices that the social complexity itself becomes an issue. And maybe that's why big giant companies have a hard time with with, like, in quotes, innovation, they always have to seem to buy little companies, or the innovation happens outside the big giant
Right.
enterprise, whatever it is, because social complexity.
Well, and you know, there's that old adage, you know, and I have no idea whoever first said this, but so many people in software don't have 10 years of experience. They have 1 year of experience 10 times. And I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure I stole this or synthesized this from Neil Ford or Mark Richards that, you know, you to be a senior technologist, an architect, or whatever you want to call it, you need to have been on a project long enough to have experienced the consequences of your decisions. And I think
yeah,
that's part of what challenges us in this industry because there's so much attrition and people changing jobs. You don't always get to close the loop to recognize that, oh, this is a really bad idea. And I did it on 3 straight
yeah,
projects.
yeah. And that's just a short history of the IT industry, I think. I like the Talib's, like, reminding people about skin in the game, and like the Hammurabi's law, which is like, if you build the house, you have to, like, go spend the first night in it. Once you
Yep.
put the roof, in case
Yep.
it collapses, you're the one that the bridge goes down on, type of situation. And that's, yeah, it's just like software, not your problem. Just
Right.
fix it as fast as you can, and somebody else will deal with this later. That's just the nature of the beast right now,
Well, and
and
how often are
that
we
has to
not
change.
the users of it? You know, I don't know if you were the one that told me this story, but I remember somewhere along the lines picking up this anecdote that the master bridge builder would be the person who'd have to sleep on the bridge for a number of nights after the bridge was completed, and that goes right
Yeah,
along with the master stonemason was the one who put the last brick in the arch, and if it collapsed, it killed him. You know, we don't have that. I mean, we spend a lot of time building software that's used by people who we never see, never talk to, we never experience it, and you know, I feel like that's at least a contributing factor to some of these issues.
well, and if you look at other fields, like, most of the things that have building codes tend to have apprenticeship models.
Yes,
Like, if you want to be a mechanic, you have to be an apprentice first, right? And this seems to not, apprenticeship doesn't seem to go well with a university degree.
sure.
Well, I guess the exception to that is doctors, right? They have to do a residency before they become, like, officially doctors, and then they have their own residence, I guess, after that. But that's I think is part of it too. That's going to be required for this, so that you get that you're doing the job, but you're getting direct feedback, not about that specific thing, but about how well you're doing the job or not doing the job.
Right.
So
So our very prolific commenter is talking about how it's hard in a college environment to sort of get people to experience sort of the cunning of a work environment and the fact that sometimes you've got a very aggressive or influential person who convinces somebody to do something that may or may not be in everyone's best interest. And yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we don't really teach that. The grad program I teach in, one of the things that we do is at least one of the projects, one of the classes we put you in groups that are by design large so that you can't get everybody on the same schedule and you're going to work with some people you don't like. And so you just have to deal with it for a semester because we've all been on that project with the person we just don't get along
right.
with and you got to suck it up and work through it. And I don't have good advice on that other than you have to be able to recognize when the way to solve this problem is to change organizations.
Yeah, and look, the real world is more complicated, but at least getting a little bit of, training in university is helpful.
Agreed.
Like, it's better to get a little bit than to get nothing. And there's yeah, that's just how it is. A little bit better than nothing. That's the stage we're at.
Well, and I feel like you've helped. I mean, I know the conversations I've had with you, the presentations I've seen. I think you're trying to help get that message out there, and I hope that today's session helps that too, because I think it's really important for people in our industry to recognize that it's more than just the latest technology. And that's frankly part of what I'm trying to do with this whole series is get people to see beyond the latest version of Spring, the latest version of Kubernetes, and realize that there's a lot more going on and how do we be a part of that larger community. And I have a lot of faith. I have a lot of hope that we'll continue to improve. But you know, we can't fall into that death trap of we've always done it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And it's sometimes I kind of go like, what is the next thing in technology? It's always hard to see it, right? Like when you look at all the waves, are we yet at the level of like electrical engineering where, they've kind of put in enough of the infrastructure that it's now the incremental rather than the revolutionary jumps? Like how many more revolutionary jumps are we going to have in software? I don't know. But are we towards the end of the revolutionary jumps, in the middle, at the beginning? I don't know.
Yeah,
It certainly feels like you can go pretty far with 1990s knowledge at
sure,
this, like with whatever is known today. You can build some very successful thing where the reason you're going to fail isn't the technology. You're no longer going to fail in IT because of technology, and that's been true, I think, now for at least 10 years.
sure.
So
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I feel like we're getting coarser grained abstractions, and that's helping. We have bigger Lego blocks to snap together. You think about spinning up infrastructure today versus 20 years ago. We can click a couple buttons and we can have some compute ready for us, right now. Whereas certainly when I first got into this industry, you'd have to fill out a bunch of forms and go to a bunch of meetings, and 6 months later, you'd have the wrong server configured.
yeah, but I mean, like that's kind of the equivalent of just-in-time inventory.
Right.
Like that is not so much a technical breakthrough as it is a cooperation, human organization of work breakthrough.
Sure.
Like Henry Ford, like famous for inventing the assembly line. He didn't invent the car, but he
Right.
invented the assembly line that made it possible to manufacture cars and make them available to everybody. Like that was his innovation. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now. Like, what are the things we need in this industry to work better together? The actually, I think the big areas where we're going to see huge jumps that are like revolution is security. That has to
Mm-hmm.
happen. No more pipelines getting hacked, and oil stops flowing, and or the security is now, like, computers are so intertwined that the security things will have a real impact in the real world,
Right.
and maybe that's what's going to drive the inspectors and the same level of professionalism. Professionalism is the wrong word because it implies people are not doing a good job, but the same level of rigor.
Yes.
You can't put a plane in the sky. You can't build a medical device. You can't, and with all those things, it's very expensive to do those. But I don't want to die from a badly behaved medical device. So
Right. Well,
it's
and I think to your point, I think that will be a forcing function that as software becomes so, to use your phrase, intertwined. I mean, software is eating the world to I guess directly quote or at least paraphrase that statement. We're going to be forced to do things in a more rigorous manner. And I feel like we're starting to see that with things like chaos engineering, a lot of the things around reliability,
yeah,
site reliability engineering, that these things in the past. I mean, just think about this. It wasn't that long ago that if your website said we're going to be down for maintenance for 48 hours, you're like, oh, well, yeah, of course. And now you go to a website and they say they're down for maintenance. You're like, are you out of your mind? How can you be down for
yeah,
maintenance? We all understand there's going to be glitches and outages, but that shouldn't be you're going to be down for the weekend. I don't even understand. I mean, I was at my son had a soccer game on Friday night, I think it was, and I was not liking my little camp chair, and so I rage ordered a camp chair. And the place I ordered it from didn't say, well, it's Friday evening, so we don't take orders. They're like, absolutely, here we're happy to take your money, and
yeah,
apparently that's going to show up on my doorstep today. So that's kind of cool. And but expectations have changed, and so I'm hopeful that as software becomes more critical in everyone's day-to-day lives, that we'll all start to do that. And in the same way that getting on an airplane is safe because they have this massive checklist they go through, all items
yeah,
hard won in many cases, we're going to start doing the same thing, that you realize, hey, before this goes to production, have we gone through a checklist? Everything good? Okay, cool. Because we can't afford to do it poorly.
yeah. That is very true.
Well, I'm sure I could spend the next hour or two just chatting with you, because it seems like every time I get on a call with you, we end up going in these amazing divergent directions, and I'm reminded that I really very desperately want to do some kind of a pair presentation with you on something somewhere, and I'm guardedly optimistic that we'll get a chance to do that somewhere in 2022.
I hope so. I
I,
hope so.
I hope so too. But I didn't even get to any of my questions. We didn't talk about food. We didn't talk about coffee. We didn't talk about Canada or weather or any of that. I'm amazed that we once again get through this much time without me getting in anything. And okay, my favorite commenter here has a good point about, or a good question. Do we think the quality of software depends on level of ethics? I, I think we're starting to see more of that crop up. I hear from more and more programs that they do have an ethics component, an ethics class, so maybe that factors into this. I don't know.
I I think it does a little bit. To quote my favorite show of all time, like Star Trek. I don't know if I'm quoting it, but Star Trek Next Generation. That is the best show because of all the ethical dilemmas they put the crew in. The Prime Directive versus like whatever it is they're trying to do.
Yep.
Ethics is one of those things that's just like really, really awesome to think about, but you can't be righteous. That's like that's like the counterintuitive. And again, learned that from like all these history courses growing up in a war zone and experiencing way too many world events for my life.
Firsthand.
Uh, but it's like if you think ethics is about doing the right thing, it's really more about consciously saying we thought through all the options, we picked the best option that we could think of,
Or the least worst option.
and we don't know after we picked it whether we were right or wrong.
Right. Right. It,
We knew that we were more right or less wrong, hopefully, but
turns out there's a lot of
it's
ambiguity in the world. You've got to be comfortable with the
oh
gray.
yeah. I mean, it's yeah. Otherwise, yeah, it's everything. You see it like too in a lot of these where people kind of like relook at some historical event. They go like, that was a wrong thing that was done because they're using a different type of standard, right? For things, right? Like than what was used at the time, and it's like it's fascinating. I mean, it's really like that again, that world history course where you get to read like actually the declassified what was put in front of the US president about major decisions they had to make. It's like, how do you make that decision?
Right.
Like
Well,
like you're like, if you really try to, it's like how?
and I think we also fail to recognize how much of this is luck and how much of it is things just broke the right way. I read my son is very fascinated by history, and so his grandparents bought him this book that focuses on, I think, like the first year of Winston Churchill taking over during World War II, and it's based on correspondence and diaries, and it's almost entirely
Yeah,
firsthand of people that were in the rooms. And it's pretty remarkable when you look at it here situated. You think, oh, it's inevitable that of course the UK would win, and the Allies would win. And then you read this and you're like, wow, there were any number of situations where if this had gone this
yeah,
way instead of that way, if this person had done this instead of that, and there were a bunch of small decisions, small outcomes that could have had a massive, massive impact on that, and then the history that would flow from that. So
yeah. I
same
mean,
with
this is yeah, so true. I mean, these are, yeah, I mean, ethics absolutely important, and having the ethicists and the people like the debates to really think through it. It's like, yeah, thanks Facebook for destroying democracy, right? Like that was the trending thing on Twitter. And when you get like approached, like, hey, do you want to, like, you're like, were they really trying to do that? No, but this is like everything seems to have unintended
yes,
consequences.
yes,
Doesn't matter what it is. It's like fantastic. You invented the automobile. Oh no, the world is burning with climate change and we're all
right,
gonna drown, right?
right.
And then it's like eh, whatever problem we solve today, that solution is gonna be the cause of the next set of problems. So, but such is the nature of the world, right? Like
Today's
hopefully,
best practices are tomorrow's anti patterns.
oh yeah, exactly. I mean, my favorite one for that is all of your design patterns are in a programming language are indicating that your programming language has missing features.
Yep, yep.
I can't remember. I remember reading this article like in the early 90s in university, and like I just read like the Gang of Four design patterns book. It would just come out, and I bought it in a physical bookstore, right? and I read the book, and then I saw this like article, and the guy was saying, well, uh, a stack was actually a design pattern in assembly language, pushing and popping arguments off of a stack. And the fact that you needed to do that was an indication that maybe you should have procedure calls.
Sure.
And now all of your newfangled object-oriented design patterns, that's just everything that's wrong with object-oriented programming languages. So
Well, well, I think this gets summed up more, and I'm going to paraphrase this comment is about empathy, having empathy for those who come after us in the code base or with this project, and realizing that sometimes the person who comes after us is us. We've all had that
yeah,
experience. You're looking at some code and you're like, what idiot wrote this? And then it dawns on you that that idiot was you. So maybe
yep,
that's it. We just need
done
some
that.
empathy.
Absolutely. Never enough empathy in the world.
Nope, nope. Well, my friend, this has been a great conversation. I thank you so much for hanging out with me on this, at least in my part of the world, sort of chilly May Monday. And I'm desperately hoping you and I get to be in the same physical space sometime in the near future. And I guess, hopefully that's maybe that's this year, maybe it's next year. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to it
Yeah,
either way.
awesome.
All right. Well, next week we
Cheers.
will
Have a good day.
we will be back with Tim Berglund, and I'm sure I'm going to talk to him about his sort of moisturizing routine, because this is one of those individuals who I'm still trying to figure out how it is he's as old as he is, because he looks like he's about 25, but that's neither here nor there. We'll get into that next week. So thank you again, my friend, and hopefully we're in the same space shortly, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.